everybody. Thank you for joining. It's very nice to see the faces that I see. And I would once again, as usual, warmly encourage everyone to put on their camera. I will not be noticing hairstyles or anything to do with grooming. So please, if you have the ability, in other words, if you feel like it, please do put on the camera. It really helps to give me a feeling of a class. This is a momentous moment, I suppose, because we begin again. And each time we begin again, we value it more. How can I say it? As the years go on, each new beginning is even more valuable. With the hope that implies. Now, we begin as usual, not at the beginning of the story, because that's how the term goes. I'm trying to. Yeah. I've got it. We begin usually in Noah with the flood, and then we are in the strange position of having missed creation and instead coming in on destruction. It's a strange way to start studying Parshat Hashavua. This year, because again of the necessities of the calendar, we begin with Lech Lecha. And at this point, we are now at the beginning of the Jewish story, of our story. Our ancestor Abraham, and the very famous opening words with which God opens up a new relationship between the divine and the human. There have been human beings before, but God has not been very happy in the end with the human experiment. There's been a lot of darkness. And so when Abraham comes on the scene, and God says to Abraham, Lech Lecha, leave everything, your land, your birthplace, the house of your father, there is a strong sense of Abraham coming out of a world that has darkness in it. That there are darkness of various kinds that he is to leave behind in order to go towards Eretz Canaan, go to the land which I will show you, right? The famous mystery of the project that Abraham is not told where he is going. And so I'd like to put it like this, that we are now at the spring, autumn of a new year. It's both spring and autumn. The autumn is the fact that it's now autumn, and that affects us, the cycle of the year. And in that moment, that autumn moment, we begin the Torah. We begin the story all over again. So it's a kind of spring. And one asks a question about the state of the world at the moment of Abraham. Does Abraham feel he is enacting spring, or does he feel already like autumn? That something is things have happened already that are not so hopeful. Of course, the banishment from the Garden of Eden, the flood, the Tower of Babel, various portentous and not altogether clear confusions, right? We're not sure what has gone wrong. What's the disorder that's happened in the world? It's called Hamas, violence, social violence. It has to do with in the end, with people speaking different languages, and thereby hangs a tragic tale that they can't really talk to each other. And it's out of that world that Abraham appears, and when God says to him, Lech Lecha, it's not actually the first mention of Abraham. In other words, we know about Abraham already from last week's Parshat. So in a way, we're coming in on the midlife of Abraham rather than on the beginning. It's not springtime. It's actually autumn. In a strange way, it's autumn at the beginning of the story. We know from the end of Parshat Noach that he had already started this journey towards Eretz Canaan by the project of his father. His father Terach had taken the family and consciously planned a journey to Eretz Canaan. Only for some reason, they had stopped halfway. No explanations given. It stopped in a place called Haran, and that's where we find Abraham when our Parsha begins. And so we begin now in the middle of things, in a sense. When there's been much failure, much experience and much failure already happened in the world. It's not a new world, it's an old world. It must have felt like an old world. And I want, before we dive into Lech Lecha, I want very quickly to pick out two moments from the early part of the story that we're not going to study, just to take the weight of them, to get a sense of the way in which the Midrash understands the age of the world. What is the position of the world at that time? The first moment I want to come in on is early in the story, and that is in chapter 2, verse 4, Perek Bet Pasuk Dalet, when God is creating the various parts of creation. And suddenly we are now coming up to the sixth day of creation. That's when we come in here. And what we read there is, Beit Dalet, what we read there is, and all the vegetation of the field, Beit He, all the vegetation of the field hadn't yet begun to be on the earth, and all the grass of the field, terem yitzmach. And twice the word terem is used. It had not yet, adayin lo, Rashi says. It doesn't mean this was before. Terem doesn't mean before. It's not a chronological statement. It's a statement about disappointed expectations. It's a statement about disillusion of some kind. We had thought that there was plenty of vegetation in the world at this point, because already on the third day, now this is a strange, right? It's a strange turn of expectations. We had read in all innocence that on the third day God had said, let the grass bring forth, tachei haaretz deshe, let the earth bring forth grass. And then we read, vatotzei, and the earth did bring forth grass. And so we have yet another example, apparently, of God's invincible triumph in creating the world. He creates the world, and the world responds to God exactly as planned. God says, and it happens. Of course, what else do you expect to happen within the story, the very orderly story of an omnipotent God? And now suddenly, in the next chapter, we get in at this moment in the story, and suddenly the narrator is pointing out, there was no vegetation yet, actually. Actually, it's a kind of a little embarrassed clearing of the throat. And so, actually, it was not yet there. Now, that expression, it was not yet, means that it is and it isn't. That you expect it to be, but somehow it hasn't made its appearance yet. There's a plan here, and we haven't given up on the plan, but it's just not yet happening. It's late, if you want to put it like that. Late development. Rashi then fills in here, and he gives, now read the verse first of all. Why was there no vegetation? Because God had not brought rain down upon the earth yet. There had been no rain, and you can't have vegetation without rain. And moreover, there was no human being yet to till the ground. So since there is no human being to till it, it's a very practical statement, it seems. Why is there no vegetation? Well, God, for his part, had not let down rain, and human being, for his part, didn't exist. Right? He had failed to exist till now. So how can you have vegetation if there's no tilling of the ground? That's the first level of reading. But Rashi quotes an extraordinary midrash that says that the earth responded to God's command to bring forth grass by bringing forth grass ad petach karka, till the opening of the ground. That is, it grew just till the surface, but it stopped growing at the surface. Why? It didn't come through beyond the surface. Lo yatsu. They don't come out until there would be a human being. And forget about tilling the ground. There would be a human being who would notice that there is no rain. and that we need rain. That is, until you have a human consciousness that notices what's missing, what's not working, and why it's not working, and knows what has to happen now, what needs to happen to make it work, until you have that kind of complex human consciousness. This is very weighted for me. Yes, a complex human consciousness that understands, recognizes ayin, that there is not. There is an ein adam up to this point. There is an absence of the human. And what is a human being? Adam ayin. A human being is that creature who can notice what's not yet there, who notices what the next thing is that has to happen. And he mevakesh rachamim. And he asks for mercy. That's the meaning of la'avod. Now, of course, that's a little bit of a stretch. That's avodah in the sense of he worshipped God. He spoke to God. He prayed to God for rain. So the first prayer that existed, really what there was in the world, God waits for it, and he deliberately creates a sort of conscious vacuum. The human being notices that this is necessary. We need rain. Otherwise, there will be no vegetation. And so he prays to God. And this teaches you, says Rashi's source in the Gemara in Chulin, that God desires the prayers of the righteous, that what God is waiting for is human prayer. That God can't do his part until there is a human being with a deep interior, right, with a lot of space inside, mentally, intellectually, for observing things, and emotionally and spiritually, for understanding what needs to happen now to interact with God so that what needs to happen will happen. Now that whole complex inner world then of Adam is essential to the completion of the world. God doesn't complete the natural world until there's a human being to recognize what's missing. Adam ayin. Human consciousness is necessary before there can be tzmicha. Tzmicha, terem yitzmach. Wonderful word. Yitzmach is to grow, to sprout. The idea somewhere of something from nothing. Right? That somewhere there's an ability to bring out of absence the thing that one desires, right? The growth of desire, a fulfillment of desire. And that has to happen first. That's the first moment I wanted to focus on before we close in on Lech Lecha. The second moment is the moment before the flood. At the end of Parshat Breshit, Perek Vav, Pasuk Vav, we read how God regrets creating man. It's a terrible turnaround. And Vayitatzev el libo, and he was saddened to his heart. Now here we enter into the depths of God's inner world, as we never will again, I would almost say. That is, it's a single moment. Right? The Torah is full of anthropomorphisms. God is angry, and God comes down, and he comes up, and it's as if he has a body. So the Torah has quite a lot of that. But this is the pasuk, I think, that gives us a sense of God having a human-like inner world, that he regrets his act of creation. And according to Rashi, that means that he mourns already. Vayit atsev is that form of sadness, which is reflexive. Vayit atsev. He is sorry for his own project, that he has had this dream of a world, and that dream has gone bad. Right? It's turned into something of a nightmare. And that sense of God having a human-like inner world, you have it in the Torah itself, of course, in the word vayit atsev, he saddened himself to himself. And then you have it in Rashi, who comments from the Midrash. What is that reflexive? And he says simply this: it was man who made God sad. It's just so poignant. I think this is the first year I've noticed it. Adam, man, had an effect on God. You'd think God would be impervious, the Almighty God. But the effect of the human on God is to make him sad. Laha'atzivo. I'm left slightly speechless as I say this, because I really have the feeling that it's almost unspeakable. That man makes God sad and makes God mourn the project. It's savon. Vayitatzev, from the word itzavon, which is a word that's a key word that's used before the flood, and it's used start from the time of the sin of Adam and Chava, where we read about the woman giving birth in Itzavon and rearing children in Itzavon, and the man plowing the field and eating in Itzavon. And in both cases, the Midrash, Rashi says, this is not just sadness. What's the sadness of eating of the? It's that the human being, what it expresses is disillusionment, disappointment. Right? That's not the experience of springtime. It's the experience, perhaps, let's say, of autumn, winter. And I want to say something about that now. It's a mixed feeling of some kind. And God has mixed feelings about the man, about the human being that he has created. If you look at Rashi there, that's exactly what he says. That there's a sense here of God casting about, what shall I do with this man I've created? What am I going to do about this? Right? Nimlach, right? He has to consult himself. He has to think it over. What am I going to do? Now, these are all anthropomorphisms. And they're very deep, and they're much more important anthropomorphisms than just physical action attributed to God. It's the God having a human, hesitant, reflexive inner world in which he changes his mind. And he thinks differently from what he thought yesterday. Now, this material, this sense of the perturbation of God leads me then, and then we will move into Lech Lecha, leads me to something that I found, a passage that I like very much in a book called Water and Dreams by Gaston Bachelard, French philosopher, psychoanalyst. He had created his own form of psychoanalysis, where he writes about the creative imagination. When it's really doing its work, it plumbs the depths of being. It comes out of the depths of one's being. It doesn't come out of a superficial place in one's being when one is asserting one's imagination, where the imagination is really at work, when one's writing poetry, when one's writing music. You have to go deep down, and you go deep down looking for the seeds that are embedded in substance. That is, you're entering into the inner world, like entering down under the earth and looking at those seeds that are down there in the dirt. And what you have then is a kind of involvement in the real stuff of things. Now that is matter, getting your hands into matter. The basic form of creativity he sees as the form of molding material, molding clay into form. That is the basic form of creativity, which isn't interested so much in the form of what will emerge, but is interested in working the material. The person who is interested in the form will sculpt from stone. He will knock away anything he doesn't want, and he's left with a nice, sharp, geometric, or very clearly delineated form, and he's satisfied with that. But for Bachelard, that's not the deep stuff. That's permanent, and it's very satisfying. Now you've achieved your final object. Whereas the person who molds in clay, which is a mixture of earth and water, and I can't resist pointing out that a mixture of earth and water is what the human being is made of. Yes, as it says, Vayitzer Hashem Elokim et Adam min ha'adama, that God molded the human being from the dust, from the earth, but clearly with water, because we've just had a description of how the rains come down after the human being prays. Right? It's back in that passage. So it's the mixture of the water of the rain, which is not really mentioned as part of a mixture, But that's how you have to imagine it. God doesn't mold dry dust. And so and then he breathes into it. And of course, we are very affected by God's breath being in the human being. That mystically, that means a lot to us, that we have God's breath in us. But I would suggest that even more powerful is this idea of God's hands at work in the clay of the human being. Trying it this way, trying it that way, working it. That's what we call work. When you work material and you deform it in order to form it, you're creating all kinds of possibilities, even monstrous ones. That's all part of the creative enterprise. And therefore, it arises out of, and this is a very important concept now with which we move into Lech Lecha, it arises out of a tolerance of dealing with ambiguous material. Not one material, but two materials, the solid and the liquid, the afar and the mayim, the dust and the water, happiness and sadness. Contradictory feelings are what the artist, right, when the artist is creating something out of himself, he is not only expressing his joy in creation. Somehow what will come out then will be a mixture of joy and sadness and various other mixtures, because it's always a combination, right? This kind of molding always has to do with combinations. And God knew that when he created the human being to start with, that it was a mixed form, right? It's a raw material that needs a lot of molding. And then he mourns the loss of the work of his hands, which is really a graphic description of you made something, you yielded the form in the end, you came to a form, and this form is no good. It's no good, but that is not the end of the story, because you keep working. Right? You didn't like this one, so you just keep working the material. Now, that sense of becoming from within, of taking things in hand, that's the urge of the creative artist, the human creative artist, with the human imagination. Matter resists you, and you enjoy that too. As you're working it, you enjoy the resistance. You don't want it to be too liquid. It resists you. You're kind of proud of it because it resists you. And at the same time, you keep working it, and you're looking in a way of finding a form through deforming. And Bachelard says, forms reach completion. If you're interested in form, then you can achieve a perfect result. But matter, never. I like that expression. Matter achieves completion.
We can't hear you.
It's not good.
And now you're back, I think.
How is that? Is that better?
Better.
Yeah. Can you repeat the last thing that you said?
I'm sorry, you should have let me know. I feel bad. Okay. The last thing that I said was Bachelard's sentence, forms reach completion. You can go to the museum and see formal objects. There they are. They're not going to change anymore. But if you're looking for something else, if you're looking for the depth of matter, for the work that can be done, you're more interested in the matter than the form, then you're interested in the depths of things. You're interested in the inner process. And one final preface. Can you hear me now? Yes? Okay. Have a look at the end of the source sheet, right? Where we're being a little creative today. If you look at the end of the source sheet, you can find Keats's Ode to Autumn. Now, I'm going to read just the first stanza. That's what you have there. Looking for ambivalence. Looking for the autumn mood. What is the autumn mood for Keats, and how does he achieve it? Season of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun. Maturing sun. Conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run, to bend with apples the mossed cottage trees, and fill all fruit with ripeness to the core. Fill the fruit with ripeness to the core. The sun is at work conspiring with the inner life of the fruit. Right? There is the inner world of the fruit. Right? And you have a sense of the inner world of the fruit being impacted by the rays of the sun. And the sun is coming into the object, which is the fruit, which has a subjectivity and feels itself swelling to the core. It might be, if you were inside that fruit, that's what you would feel, filled with ripeness, more and more till you burst. Right? There's something joyful about that, filling up, but there's also something ominous. Because once you are full, then there can only be rotting. Then everything falls off the branch, and we know what happens after that. So I won't read any more, but if you read on, you can see more of this motif. That is, it's a motif of the inner world. Let's say the fruit is the subject, and then something outside affecting my inwardness and creating a mixed mood of joy and overfullness. And the understanding that this means the end. You talk about, right, rather, a mature woman, right? You know that you're not exactly talking about someone in the spring of her youth. Yeah? Maturing sun, right? The maturing sun raises shadows. It raises ghosts. At the time that Keats wrote, there was a very real fear. Scientists thought that the sun was dying. The solar system was going to come to an end in quite short order. It affected literature. There are things that you can read that are notions that are affected by this idea. At any rate, so what are we talking about next? We're talking about Lech Lecha. We come back to our subject, where God says to someone we've met already, go, and then there's the word Lecha. And Lecha, Rashi translates, if you have a look at it on your page, Lehana'atcha u'letovatcha. God is addressing our forefather, our ancestor, and the first thing God tells him is really a promise. God is promising Abraham that if you do what I'm asking you to do, it will be for your benefit. Hana'ah v'tova. In other words, you will be a clear gain. Rovach naki for you. Right? It's almost an economic idea in it. Hana'ah. Hana'ah has that sense of your economic status, your financial status will improve considerably. Have a look at how Rashi continues. What does that mean? First of all, as far as your state of childlessness is concerned, you start from a sad state. Your wife is barren. And that we know already as a situation that Sarai is in. Vatihi Sarai akara ein lavalad. No possibility of a child. And Abraham is not the subject of that. That's his wife. Avram is not the subject. But here now, the assumption is that this childless man, and if you look at Rashi, this is how he translates it. God is saying to him, if you stay here, you will never have children. If you go there, you will have children. In other words, there's here, it's a kind of ominous, or it's almost like reading the omens. There's a gzar-din against you. Midrash will use that expression. There is an edict out against you already that you are childless. That's how it is. You and your wife are childless. But if you go there, so it's worth your while to go on this journey. And then Rashi carries on. And then I promise I will make you into a great nation. That is, you really will there have children. Why? Why does God have to make a promise, a special blessing? Because in general, it's counter-indicated to go on a long journey if you're trying to get pregnant. That's more or less what Rashi says. That is, that journeys, haderech, goremet, causes lema'et, causes a diminishment in three powers, human powers, in fertility, in money, and in reputation. You don't get a chance to build up a local reputation, right? So somewhere you're a successful life in the world, and we're not here in the inner world. It's not Abraham's inner world. It's his success in the world. So it'll really be good for you especially if you do something that's really so irrational as to go on a journey which is actually a curse for someone in a rather poor state in terms of fertility and perhaps other things as well. So there's a sense again, I'm repeating, of Abraham not in a kind of spring-like mode. He's not a young man anymore, right? Travel. And against the odds, you will get these blessings. Moreover, and I'm jumping now to the end of the passage there in number 1, Asher Areka, go to the land which I will show you. Now here is, of course, the real, right, that's the ambivalence somewhere. That's the doubleness here. It's almost ironic. Here is God promising and giving blessings and go against the odds. Right? The paradox, it's an irrational move, I know, but just trust me. Here you will not have children, there you will. It's a matter of getting there. But then God doesn't tell Abraham where. Which might lead you to think that it's not the destination that's important, but the journey itself. It really doesn't matter where you're going. We're not prepared to say that exactly, because where they're going is Eretz Israel, and that obviously has some importance. Nevertheless, why does God not tell Abraham in epic style? If you want to have an epic beginning, so it would be, go and there you will give them the name of the land, and you'll know exactly where you're going, and it's purposeful, and it's heroic, and everything that starts an epic. What does Rashi say? Lo gilalo haaretz miyad. Doesn't this remind you of the vegetation? God delayed letting him know which country he was going to. Lo gilalo miyad. He didn't tell him right away. Well, of course you want to know right away when you're going on a journey, right? Isn't that the first thing? You look up at the board there in the airport and you make sure that the destination is clearly written. Well, without a destination, what are you doing? It's a form of madness. And the Midrash actually picks up on this theme of Abraham's madness. There's a deep disorder in Abraham's life as he travels towards that land where he will find all blessing, where he will find all the blessings counterintuitively. Madness, in the Midrash, it takes this form. People say, look at that old man, looking like a meshuggah. It's actually the word that's used. Meshuggah, shogea, has to do with wandering all over the place, of disorder. Shogea, shogeg. And he looks like a crazy person. Have you ever seen someone who travels and doesn't know where he's going? You're going on a journey and you have no idea where you're going. What kind of journey is that? Journeying is so destructive of resources. It's not a happy thing to be doing in those days. And even now, it's not totally a pleasure. You go for the destination. And here we have the sense of the popular view of Abraham as somehow all over the place. He's mindless. He doesn't have a proper intentional mind. And he somehow seems to be able to live like that. And then perhaps the idea arises, why does God not show him and leaves him to wander around all over the place? As Ramban actually says, if you have a glance at number 2, the passage just before the one I have on your page in number 2, that Abraham was noded v'holech. He was wandering around, navanad, like Cain. What an association. Yes, the word noded means to wander all over the place, aimlessly. And if we know the Torah, we know where that word has been before. And it's been with Cain. That was his curse. And here now, Ramban is picking up that word. This is poetry. This is the Torah as poetry. This is the Ramban as poetry. This is the Midrash as poetry, which is what I'm interested in. What is happening in these evocative passages? He was wandering around. Could have put it more simply. He was simply traveling. He was wandering around from one nation to another, from one people to another, without a clue where he was going, until he arrived at Eretz Canaan, and that's 7 verses later. but who knows how long it took him, these 7 verses. It could have been years. And there God said to him, to your seed I have given this land. And that is God showing Abraham in the end, this is your destination. So the time you need to know your destination, you would have thought would be before. But there's an adain lo, not yet. Abraham living in suspense, without clarity, without clear knowledge. Ki haya to'eh k'se oved, very evocative words at the end of the Ramban in number 2, that he was wandering around like a lost lamb. And that's a quotation, of course, from Tehillim, the last psalm, actually, if I remember rightly, where the psalmist cries to God, Ta'iti k'se oved bakesh avdecha. I'm like a lost lamb, been wandering around like a lost lamb. Find your servant. So it's the cry of the lost, asking God to plot me on the map. Give me a map so that I know where I am in the world, so I can orient myself. And that is the psalmist, the Ramban is evoking here. He's just bringing him up from the depths. He brings up to give us a sense of the anxiety of Abraham's condition, what it means to travel in this way. And with this, let's have a look now at the meaning of traveling to an unknown place. The journey to a place that perhaps you know the name of it, but you don't know anything about what it's going to be like. Right? That would be a more moderate version of really not knowing at all where your destination is. So if you have a look at the midrash, the first midrash, there are 3 significant midrashim that I want to bring into play. Number 3 is the very first midrash on Lech Lecha. It's a very famous one, because this is the one that sets the key for a different kind of understanding of Lech Lecha. Not travel for your benefit. Nothing so pragmatic. But travel, as the Zohar puts it, letikuncha ulegormecha. For the reforming of you, tikkun, and ligrom is to bring into being. For the creation and the formation, the process of formation, right? The molding of you. And that, the Zohar's translation of Lecha, takes us into inward depth things. We're now taken into the inner world of Abraham, which needs some kind of molding. See, he has to work with materials in order to become a self. He has to work internally with his own materials, which are quite contradictory in some ways. It's a combination of things. Look where he comes from. Look what we say on the Seder night. Yes, we begin with the Gnut. We begin with the bad news, which was Ovdei Avodah Zarah Hayu Avotenu, that our fathers were idol worshippers, and going back to Abraham, who was himself an idol worshipper. And we move now to the Midrash. Vayomer Hashem el Avram Lech Lecha. Rabbi Yitzchak Patach. So Rabbi Yitzchak quotes from Tehillim, from the Book of Psalms. Number 3. Shim'i bat uri'i, listen, O daughter, and see, and incline your ear, and forget your people and the house of your father. Now we just plunge into this passage in the Book of Psalms, in which a young woman is being told to pay attention, to see, to pay hati oznech, pay attention to her situation, closely enter into it, into the depths of it, and forget your people and the house of your father. Now, suddenly again, there's that shock of 2 things combined that don't necessarily go together. On the one hand, pay attention, be alert, senses alive. And on the other hand, forget your past. And that pasuk now, the Midrash wants to have ringing in our ears when we read what God says to Abraham. When he says to him, leave the house of your father, right? leave your land. And that is that Abraham is in the position of a young woman. It turns out to be a young bride as we go on. It's a bride who's leaving home for the first time in her life to go to an unknown destination. It is, you may know the name, but which is a marriage to, to another prince somewhere a long way away. So she is facing the unknown. She's in a situation of great alertness, readiness to take on something that she doesn't know, and she's not going to be helped by her past. Her past, as it were, peels away from her. Something, in a way, she has to dispose of, turn her attention away from her past and move into that unknown future. That highly gendered analogy, it's really quite astonishing, isn't it? Here is Avram, who is going to be a father in spite of all the odds, in spite of what we know already about him, who has to forget his barrenness, as it were, somewhere to move out of that single reality that he's been living in, and now complicate it by moving into a different reality. He is no longer a he, but he is a she now. He is a bride who is innocent, who doesn't know anything about what marriage is, right? In some way, she is facing that unknownness. Let's continue reading the Midrash, and then we'll come back to it a bit later. Rabbi Yitzchak continues, what was this like, the situation of the bride? It's like someone who was traveling from place to place, and he saw a castle on fire, doleket. Let's translate it that way. Doleket is adlika, castle on fire. Yeah, the truth is that there is another classic understanding, which is just the opposite. And we're interested in opposites. That is a castle that is brightly illumined. It's got lots of hadlakat ner, right? Lots of lights burning in it. And when he sees, all right, which way are we going to go with this? Let's go with the sad theme. That is, the castle is on fire. And what happens then? He says, Tomar, would you say, Shahabira hazu below manhig? Would you say that this castle is without anyone in charge? That there's no one in residence there? There's no owner of the castle. Why would you think such a thing? Right? It's put in the potential form. Would you say? Yes, you would. The answer would be yes, you would, because it's burning and no one's doing anything about it. It's on fire and so you might think there's no one in charge. Of course, if the castle is brightly lit, right, and it's complicated, if it's brightly lit, then the question comes to mean something different. No, you wouldn't say that there's no one in charge. You would understand there's someone looking after it because all the candles are burning throughout the castle. There's life going on there. And then what happened? Hitzitz alav bal habira, the owner of the castle, peered out at him. Hatzatzah. It's not just looked at him or was seen by him. It's a sense somehow of just the eye beams, the glance, meeting the traveler, looking at the traveler. It's a moment, and he says to him, Ani bal habira. I am the owner of the castle. In other words, the owner introduces himself. God says, no, you shouldn't say it. I know it looks like that the world is on fire. It's on fire with, the Buddhists have a lot to say about the world being on fire with lust and ignorance and passions and envies and hatreds and so forth. One only has to look at the newspaper. But God says, in spite of everything, I'm in charge of this. So there's a mixed experience now. It's a kind of paradoxical experience. You can't forget that the castle is on fire. And at the same time, I am the master of the castle. Well, how does this apply to Abraham? Abraham was also asking, is this world, would you say that it's without anyone in charge? That's obviously the analogy. The world is the castle on fire. And then God hits a love, this little hatzatza, just a spark of a glance. And he says, I am. In other words, it's the merest introduction. No explanations. What about the fire? Why am I not stopping the fire? And so on. All the obvious questions. Nothing is answered. It's a glance. It's a glance that simply claims the traveler and says, no, you can't think there's no one in charge. From now on, you're going to be living on the horns of a dilemma. That is, what is the answer? I have to do something about it. That the owner wants me to do. Is it a demand of some kind being made on me to do something about the burning world? But that's already a guess. That's a speculation. We're reading the Midrash now. But as it stands, there's no answer. And then the Midrash ends by going back to the bride. We go back to the book of Psalms. It continues there. V'yitav hamelech yofyech ki hu Adonayich. And the king, you will go on this journey, right? You'll forget your background, your home, the house of your father. And the king will desire your beauty, for he is your Lord, let's say, in a sort of old world sense. The gendering here is very strong, if you know what I mean. What you have here is a hint, right? That the bride is having hinted to her something she knows in theory, and that is that her beauty will play a role in her future. And that her beauty and the beauty theme is brought to the fore here. And he will desire, there will be beauty, there will be a different kind of relationship to him and to the world. And the words themselves don't tell her enough. Right? They don't give her sufficient information, because really what's going to change is herself. This is going to be a deep transformation. And she can't understand it before she's there, before she's gone through it. That's the position of Abraham, the Midrash wants to say. And when God says, go to yourself, it means go to your future unknown self, which is a suggestion of, has a meaning of anxiety and meaninglessness about it. That is, I don't really know what that means yet. That God desires your beauty to make you beautiful in the world. That is, what is the destiny of the bride? What is Abraham's destiny? It's a world destiny. It's not just a private relationship with God, although that's at the core of it, right? The sun is now invading Abraham, as it were. The sun is coming and filling him to the core. And he doesn't know, right? He's going to be ripened. There's a process of maturing, which will be a very intimate experience. If I think about intimacy, that it's going to be an experience of getting to know things in the deepest possible way, in the way that the hand knows material, right? That kind of sensual way, which Bachelard is so interested in, which has to do with molding things from inside, not just creating a nice superficial shape. And on that level, this must be an occasion of great anxiety for Abraham. And so I'm suggesting this anxiety is perhaps the experience itself. The anxiety of being between a past that is no longer relevant. It doesn't mean it'll disappear. Maybe it'll haunt you in some level. And we will see that as we go on with the story. But as consciously, what you are to do is set your eyes to a future without being able to focus on anything you already know, to understand what the future will be. And so it's a very poignant, and again, I stress, I think the feminine, the identity, Abraham's identity is being just transformed here. He has become a woman. He has become a bride. And we, the reader, are supposed to appreciate the achievement of the Midrash. That the Midrash is here molding the clay. It's saying, actually, Abraham is not Abraham who's Abraham. He will be Avraham at some point. He's going to change his name. There'll be a circumcision. He's going to change his body. And in the imagination of the Midrash, he is a young bride. Right? You shouldn't be put off by that analogy. You should have a free enough, fluid enough imagination to be able to take that on, because it goes deep to the heart, to the core of inner experience. Ramban says, Asher Areka, you should go to the place where I will show you. And we looked at number 2. Have a look now at number 4. Ramban's problem, this is a later, slightly later comment. The problem that troubles Ramban is, go to the land which I will show you. It's not the which I will show you part. It's God addressing Abraham without any reason at all for the command. Why does God accost Abraham in this way? What has Abraham done as a subject in the story to deserve God's speaking to him, addressing him, choosing him, promising him, putting him through the mill in the way that we've started thinking about? Who is Abraham after all? We know nothing about him. And what does it mean to travel as an end in itself? Since God doesn't even say where you're to go, then it's a sense of an irrational journey. Just travel for the sake of traveling? Travel for the sake of leaving the land that you are in? Is that the whole point? Just to get away from where you are? Is it lech me? That's very clear what you're to leave. Your land, your birthplace, the house of your father. Is that the whole point? Is that the point of the journey? Why does, right, the Ramban is very exercised by this. Why does God, there is no ta'am here. The Torah doesn't, lo be'era kol ha'inyan ki ta'am. What's the point? What's the flavor? Matam. The reasoning, the meaning. What's the meaning that God telling him, leave your land and I'll do good things for you? It comes out of the blue without any sense of the human subject who's receiving. Why is this something that is coming to him? Because of the things we know about him. He's not described as a tzaddik tamim, for instance, as even Noach, about whom we have rather ambivalent traditions. Even he is called a perfectly righteous man, and that's supposed to justify the flood and the epic story of his life. And Abraham comes, and there's nothing to justify this great Lech Lecha journey. We don't know anything about him at all. It's not like a spiritual journey. It doesn't say, travel before me, hithalech lefanai v'heyeh tamim. And Ramban, he's always very elusive. He's referring to a later moment, right, at the end of Parshat Lech Lecha, where God does say to Abraham, after a lot of journeying, and after he's arrived in Eretz Yisrael, and he's gone out of Eretz Yisrael, and a lot of water has run under the bridge, then God gets around to telling Abraham, go on a spiritual journey. Hitalech lefanai, walk before me and be whole. And that be whole, the paradox is, circumcise yourself. Become whole. There is a commandment to become, clearly in the text, but beginning, the Lech Lecha, seems to be purely materially to go on a journey. Right? It's the experience of road fatigue. Go on a journey, and the sensual experience of going sensual. Yeah, Bachelard likes that word. Not sensory, but sensual. That means entering into the depths of an experience. Going on a journey, a long, endless journey. That is an experience. Not an experience in the way that, young people with stars in their eyes say, oh, that was an experience. It was a chavaya. It wasn't a chavaya. It was a nisayon. A nisayon, which we translate a test. Yes, and the sages say that Abraham had 10 tests, which are really not delineated clearly in the text of the Torah. One of them was Lech Lecha, perhaps the first one was Lech Lecha, and it's a nisayon, a test in the meaning of a deep experience, a deep and difficult and in a way endless experience. You can't make ultimate meaning out of what right? There's no ultimate in this. It's material, it's raw material that he will be working. And so Ban says there is no time. Except that now I'm going to tell you what the town really is. The town really is, and he goes off into a story about Abraham's prehistory to show that Abraham really did deserve that God really was a personality. He was a God-seeking personality. The story of Ur-Kasdim, right? The story about how Abraham, right? It's a midrashic story which doesn't exist in the Torah at all. And Ramban is compelled to call on it by way of justifying or rationalizing Lech Lecha. That Abraham wasn't a nobody. He was someone who had broken his father's idols, you remember, who was hauled up to court and threatened with death by fire. And God does a miracle. And Ramban refers to this very, very sketchily. The king was persecuted for his monotheistic beliefs, that he was teaching about the true God, to the point where he was almost martyred, but God did a miracle for him. Right? Something like that. He was thrown a very skeletal story of this kind, because otherwise, what are we going to think? Again, Ramban keeps repeating, Ein Tam. There is no rhyme or reason to the Lech Lecha moment. Who is Abraham, after all? And maybe that's what Ramban is really afraid of. He doesn't want an irrational moment. Perhaps, on the other hand, if we now leap to relatively modern times, the Mea Shiloach, the end of the 19th century, will say, and I didn't put it on your page, it's really just one sentence I wanted to bring to your attention. He will go as far as to say, and this indicates how far we've traveled, since the Ramban and the Rambam, who both will look for a concrete story, an origin story for Abraham. Only if we have a real origin story, a heroic martyrdom story, only then can we justify Lech Lecha. What does the Mea Shiloach say, the Ishbitzer? He says, go to the land which Asher Areka, go to the land which is called Asher Areka. The name of the land, Mea Shiloach knows the name of the land, Eretz Canaan. It's in the Torah. What you go on an endless journey, Asher Ein Lo Sof. And by saying that, of course, the Mea Shiloach is declaring himself a modernist. He belongs at the moment in history in which journeys have a kind of endless quality. They're not just pragmatic journeys, but the quest is one in which there is a deep inner reality that hasn't yet come to fruition. And somewhere that will begin to actualize through the journey itself. But there will be no final form. This is endless self. There will be no end to that questing, for that looking for the place of dvekut, as he puts it, which Abraham is looking for. He's looking for a place of clinging, being one, being intimate with God, of having God in his inner world. And that's a kind of endless quest. Have a look at the Rambam. And here again, I'm just going to point at a couple of things as we move back to the Midrashic material. The Rambam is a very classic, very important passage at the beginning of Hilchot Avodat Kochavim about paganism, about idolatry, and the way in which Abraham began his life, Hitchil, at the beginning of his life in the world. He was weaned physically, and he began to wander in his mind while he was still very small. So from a very young age, approximately the age he was physically weaned, right? The sensual experience of weaning, he knew it in his mouth, his body. At that time, he began also to cut free of the moorings of his local culture, and he began to wander around, and he began to think by day and night. That's the first line there. He is the philosopher for the Rambam. He is the man of intellect, the man inspired by wonder, tama. The Rambam actually uses the word. He was wondering, tama. He was confounded, he was confused what actually makes the stars and the planets go round? Right? It's the Aristotelian question, the primal cause. What is the first cause? And here you have the Rambam picking up that tradition of Aristotle. For the Rambam, Aristotle was the sum of human wisdom. He uses Aristotle in a totally respectful way. He doesn't think in terms of transcending Aristotle. What the Jewish religion has to add is something else. It's not the philosophical issue. And so here is the Rambam as pure intellect, Avraham as pure intellect, and there he is roaming around, and even while he is mushkah be'ur kasdim, even while he's sunk, he's absorbed into that world of ur kasdim among all those stupid idolaters. You get a feeling of somehow the contempt, the intellectual contempt for these benighted pagans, and they were worshipping kochavim, idols, and he was worshipping with them. It's one of the astonishing moments in the passage. Hu oved imahem, right? That's the 4 lines down. That is, as he was continuing to conform to the local culture and to the local over many years, his mind was free and active, detached from his body, right? In this sense, no molding of opposites. The mind is free to cut to the quick and get very quickly, right, to the idea of the one God who makes everything else revolve, makes everything else move in the world, the primal cause. And then he began to debate with people. By the time he was 40, he had arrived at that truth. And he began to debate with people and to dissuade them, try to refute their beliefs until he became a political danger. And yes, he's trying to persuade people to break idols, right? He evokes something of that, breaking the idol, that physical idea. But what he means is he was an iconoclast, and he is trying to persuade people away from their intellectual, philosophical errors. And when he was being too successful, the king wanted to kill him because he had become a political danger, and a miracle was done for him. And after that, he left Haran because it wasn't safe there, and he began to call out in the name of God. That is, he went on his journey, and the expression to call out in the name of God is used as it is in the Torah itself, which means to gather people around him. He began to gather disciples around him. Many, many disciples joined him as he traveled. He's a kind of a pilgrim who is creating a theological, social entity around him. And he is having debates one-on-one with people. That's another nice detail. Why is that so interesting? Each person, he argues with each person according to his state of intellect, where he is. Yeah. What does it evoke immediately for those of us for whom the Greek world is still somewhere alive? Right, this is Socrates. Right? Rambam is basing his Avraham. He's not shy to do it. Somewhere on one of the greatest heroes that the human being that the ancient world knew, and that is Socrates, who was willing to die. Because the king found him, and the authorities found him a danger to the body politic, that he was corrupting the youth in his dialogues. Right? He would have one-on-one dialogues with people. And so Avraham has to do that as well in order to be like Socrates. And in the end, he has myriads of people around him. And so he must be giving some large lectures as well. He's also doing that, and he writes books also at the end. Right at the end there. So he is the consummate intellectual, the philosopher, who arrives at his conclusions fairly, right, at the age of 40, which is not exactly first youth, but it's not old age either in terms of his lifespan. In maturity, he arrives at the truth, and then there's no more seeking, and he now lives his truth. He's able to travel and to affect others. And a world is created. He becomes the father in that sense, the intellectual father of a new world. Now that version, leaves me wondering again, what is the inner world of someone who is coming at truth, who needs some, right? The sun has to shine on him. He has to become filled with a deep reality, which is not the reality of before. The way the Rambam puts it is that he persuaded people, shatal bilibam ha'ikar hagadol, in the last line, right at the bottom. He implanted in their hearts the great principle. The great principle, this great principle of the one God, shatal means he implanted in them. That is, he put in the plants ready-made. It doesn't necessarily mean the seeds that they are to work with. What he did was he transplanted ideas from his mind to their mind. And that is one notion of education. And there can be quite serious education that has to do with that. But I want to suggest the Rambam, when he says this, he is consciously going against, taking a stand against the whole Midrashic tradition. And that's what you want to follow up now in the few minutes that we have left. What does the Midrashic tradition have to say about inside and outside? What happens when a person deep in his or her core undergoes a transformation? The work of change. If it's a matter of transplanting an idea or an identity, even worse, from someone else's mind into your mind, then one might even call that idolatry. There's something about that as we have increased our understanding of the depth of the human psyche and of the role of the non-rational in the human psyche, we begin to understand more and more that this won't work. The interesting thing is that in the Midrash, going back 2,000 years, there is this understanding. If you look at the imagery that you find in the Midrash, you find a sense of a stage of things. Have a look, for instance, at, we're going back now to the Midrash about the traveler. What is it that happens to Abraham when he suddenly stops and has this vision of the burning castle, which might be something else too, and has God peering out at him and telling him, I am the master of the castle. The Mea Shilach, number 6. End of the 19th century. Here we're going very far away from the Rambam. It's the other end of the spectrum. Quotes from Yeshayahu. Ki etzak mayim al sameh. When I pour water on someone who's thirsty, v'nozlim al yivasha, or liquids on dry land, that irrigating dryness, thirst. That's a dryness and wetness together. Yes, as we said, the afar and the dust and the rain together. And that is an image for absolute, a radical movement. There are two sides to this process. There is the side that's pouring the water, the wet side, but that's not enough. If God were to pour water and you were not dry and you were not thirsty, it wouldn't do any good at all. God can't force the water. God can't implant the water in you. It's only if you are thirsty, if you are walking around with a sense of absence, with a sense of disharmony, of something, right? A sense of suspension. No, something is not here. There's a kind of wandering there. And that's the way in which I will pour out my spirit upon your seed and my blessing upon your offspring. That's the end of the pasuk in Yeshayahu. All right, so we're talking here about seed, right, which is the seed of human beings, the seed of Israel. How can God affect that seed? Only if there is a sense of quest. That's what Abraham was, says the Mea Shilach. He was seeking and questing the root of his own life. Now, what gives him the right to say this about Abraham when there's no hint of it in the text? That he was aching to find the root of his own life. All we know about him, and that's indirect, is that he's barren. His wife is barren. Are you going to say that he also feels in some way fruitless, that he hasn't got a root to his life, root, shoresh? No, there's a kind of sexual spiritual implication here. I don't know if I want to suggest that even. I've suggested it, but I've implanted it. but there's a question here. The Mer Shiloach feels free to be able to raise this image now and say, Abraham must have been dry and thirsty, looking for the root of his own life. That is, looking at the blessings in his own life and saying, that is not worth calling life. That is, if I'm to give a name to my own experiences, I can't call the fact that I have enough money to live by and I have enough food to eat, and so on and so on. I can't call that chayim. All it means is that I don't have the impediments that make it even harder to try to find what is real life. But that's not chayim itself. So he's looking for an essence of some kind. He's looking for the thing itself, true life. Can't be in all the desires of this world, it has to be something else. And that's why God then looks out at him, hatzatza, alav, hitzitz alav. Mer Shiloach emphasizes that less important word, it's almost nothing, at him. And says, wouldn't you normally say hitzitz elav? He looked towards him, elav, to look towards, el. Instead it says alav, and he translates it most powerfully. Not just God unilaterally looking at Abraham. It's not a one-way street. He is indicating, he's pointing Abraham out to himself. He's turning his face in that flash of a meeting of faces, yes. He's pointing his face towards Abraham and saying, look at yourself. Right? It's an extraordinary reading. Look at yourself. Only you are so disturbed. You know that you're living your life in a kind of restlessness, in a kind of sense of disharmony. Perhaps the times Abraham was living in, the Mer Shiloach goes as far as to say, was the time of the Tower of Babel, Dor HaFlaga, in which there's a general confusion. Babel is confusion. Like the Mabul, they come from the same root. Right? The idea of Bilbul and Balal, and combinations of things that don't make sense. And Abraham is living, what is the state of the world at that time? It's represented in Abraham's deepest being. It's not that he has something true and pure in his deepest being. Forget about that. It's that he in his deepest being knows about that confusion and is seeking restlessly for. And God says to him, what does God say to him? Very simply, he says, look at you. Don't you think it's interesting that you alone of all your friends have this disturbance? Become aware of your own singularity. Presumably, Abraham wasn't so happy about his singularity because it hadn't led him anywhere good. It was an anxious experience so far. And like all, what can I say? Yeah, talented, spiritually gifted people, don't quite know how to define this. Youth is a very difficult time. It's a time of seeking and questing and being different and asking yourself, why am I different? Why am I different from everyone else? And he's evoking this. And he's saying, what does God then do to him? He doesn't look at him and say, yes, here's the answer. He looks at him and says, look at you. There's your answer. In that very state of kushiyah, in that state of questioning, of difficulty, kasheh, that life is difficult for you, that you're in some way stumped. There's a wonderful translation in your translation. There's that you are lokashelahem. It's not hard for other people. So the translator gives us, they are not stumped by life. It's rather nice. That is, they take it's all in the day's work. That's how the world is. And you are really bothered. And that bothering in itself is the answer to your question. That is, God doesn't answer Abraham. He says, I am the owner of the castle. All he says is, I'm throwing that into the mix. There is something that has addressed you, has claimed you, has called out to you, Ani Bahabira. And in a further working of this material, we're talking about the working of the clay, the Talmud, the student of the Mea Shiloach, Rabbi Tzadok HaKohen, goes as far as to say, Ani is your Ani. That if you look deep into yourself, that's where you will find the Ani, the divine, who is the master of the castle. And where will you find it? In the troubled state that you're in. Not by finding some kind of magical solution, but somewhere through that agitation that pushes you to be restless and not to be content with the answers that are so easily offered. That's very profound reading and very difficult reading. It leaves us with a sense of Abraham as work in progress and a reflexive sense of himself, as that he is the one who has to work the material that so far only seems to come out deformed. He's not satisfied with it. He can't find a way of making it good. The next midrash is number 7. Vayomer Hashem el Abraham, v'brach yapatech. Quotation from Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs. L'reach shmanecha tovim shemen turak shemecha. Something about your oils, the fragrance of your oils are delicious, and your name is like decanted oil, it's like poured oil. It's a compliment to the beloved. Who does this apply to? It applies to Abraham. What is Abraham like? Startling midrash again, full of this kind of deep reverie of imagery. Litzlochit shel apofil simon, like a bottle, a flask of, let's say, perfume, fragrance, spices, solidly wedged into place and laid in a corner. In other words, corked up or tight and lying in a corner. V'lo haya reicho nodef. Its fragrance doesn't exude. Its fragrance doesn't go out into the world because it's precious stuff. It looks like nothing. I'm imagining the old bottles of perfume, which you don't even see anymore these days. But I remember when I was a child actually being impressed by my mother's tiny little, the real essence. Nothing, but dense, deep, with potential, with what it has, the power that it has in it. But if it's all corked up, it can't do anything. It may be perfume, but it can't do perfume. When it was mitaltelet, when it was shaken up, mitaltel, tiltul, wonderful evocative word. Tiltul, I looked it up, I have a whole list of synonyms in English. If you can catch some of them as they're flying. Homeless is to be homeless, banished, decentered, unsteady, distracted, distraught, deranged, traveled. It's to swing, to hurl, to be in exile. It's a word for road fatigue now. I'll tell it. Is a word for road fatigue, to be shaken up, to be confused, to be hurled, to lose one's balance. That is, it's not a directed movement from here to there. It's not a purposeful movement, knowing exactly where you're going. When the perfume has to be waved around in the air, aimlessly, crazily, madly, right? With a sense somewhere of not knowing any direction at all. It's the work of the unconscious. That is what is Avraham at this point? He is someone who has to release his essence, his being on the world, and then the perfume will affect the world. That's what God said to Avraham, Taltel atzmacha mimakom lemakom. right? Shake yourself around, agitate yourself from place to place. It's a way of talking about aimless traveling, about that kind of disruption of order that's involved in that kind of constantly living out of a suitcase, or however one wants to imagine it. And that, that completely can I say, it's almost like an unminded state. It's a state not of consciously trying to find a conclusion, but of casting about, and it's that state that will come to affect other people like perfume. That is, when they meet you, right? This is not you will give lectures, you will give large lectures to people. You will encounter people and you will be like perfume. That's a very daring image again. If he was a bride before, now it's even worse in a sense, because now he is, what is he? What the effect that he's going to have on the inner lives of other people? That's what we're talking about, intimacy. He's going to have an intimate effect, with which Rachamim has something in common. The idea of compassion, the idea of not being something absolute in himself, that he's going to take and implant into the other person. We're not dealing with solids, we're dealing with liquids. We're dealing with liquids and solids mixing up together. And the idea then would be here that what he is doing is trying to evoke in the other person, as perfume evokes, right? Perfume, according to perfume, according to those big advertisements in the fashion magazines. Yes, you have a whole page advertisement of a bottle of perfume, and the idea, of course, is the picture is of a man and a woman. That is, it's perfume that creates the erotic, that creates the mixing of things, opposites mixing, and then birth. That is, things come to birth through perfume. Words can act like perfume. Your words can be words that evoke, that act like hints. A hint. What is a hint? A hint is like perfume. It's almost nothing. It's a suggestion. It's an opportunity. And according to the Medrash, that is Abraham's effect on the world. It's not that he was the philosopher teaching philosophy. There was something about who he was becoming, this deep becoming that was going on inside him that affected other people. Which is, I have to say, in my own experience, when I've been very moved spiritually by someone, it has always been that sense of a person who is deep in work, who is working in a sense of being able to bear not being a finished product, not being completely there yet. And that sense of things is how he will affect other people. Your name will become great in the world. This sense of things means that you actually, apparently, visibly, nothing much seems to be happening. But your very being, your becoming, will make others become. Oseh nefashot. You'll be creating inner worlds. You'll be helping other people to deal with their inner worlds. One more midrash, and with that we will come to not exactly a conclusion, but some kind of, I think, deeper notion. Number 8. Again, Breshit Rabbah. L'cha tal yaldutecha. God says to Abraham again, in the words of, I'm not sure where the source is, L'cha tal, do you have it there in the English? For you is the dew of your youth. What was Abraham? Who was Abraham? Abraham was, at the moment of Lech Lecha, he was someone who was mitpached. He was full of anxiety and fear. And he said, would you say that I still have in my hands sin? I used to be an idolater all those years. In other words, Abraham feels the complicated nature of his own being, the perhaps incoherent nature of his own being, that he is a mixture of things. Perhaps it's still there. The sin was in me. I did it. It came out of me. Why should I think it's no longer there? And he's worried about this. That's who Abraham was. And so God said to him, L'cha tal yarutecha. Think about dew. the dew of your youth. What is dew? You are now dew. Never mind being perfume, you're now dew. Just as this dew is poreach, it touches down and it disappears. It diffuses. It's almost nothing. It's a drop that evaporates. You see the similarity to the perfume. Yes. So your sins, they were there and they have evaporated. Porchim. We're being led into what I'm calling, what Bachelard calls, the sensuality of an attempt to understand spiritual life. But the only way to get inside the working is through what he calls the material imagination. The imagination that can really bring home to oneself what this moment is like. Just as this dew is a sign of blessing to the world, so you are a sign of blessing to the world. And now, cutting things very short because our time is almost up. Let me just sum up what the Shem Mishmal says about this. What are we saying here? What is God saying to Abraham? What's the good news here? Your sins, you don't have to worry about them because, all right, they were here, but they've flown away. And you are a sign of blessing to the world, like dew. To be a sign of something means that you're not the thing itself. Siman bracha is that you are an indication, you're a pointer, you're a hint. It needs reading. You need to read the sign. What is the reading here? And so the Shem Mishmuel, another late 19th century Hasidic commentary, says this, and I'm just paraphrasing loosely. He says, what about this vanishing dew, the dew that the people, when they prayed, in Sefer Hosea, they asked to be like, God should be like rain to them. Become like rain. That's what the people asked for. And according to the Gemara in Ta'anit, that was not an appropriate request. If you're really looking for the right answer to your question, don't ask for rain. God, you don't want God as rain. And so God says, I'll teach you, I'll give you an answer that is appropriate. Ehiyeh katal Israel. I will be like dew to Israel. That's also from Hosea. It's in number 9. And so the Shem Mishmal, what does he make of this? He says the problem with rain is, although it's plentiful and wet, it gives you a lot to work with, is that it sinks into the flower and it stays there. The flower is saturated with it, or the grass. And that means that the grass, the flower, Zilomi atzmam, machmat atzmam, has nothing to contribute. It's just a passive recipient of revelation, of blessing. And that's not what you should be asking for. You should be asking for revelation, blessing, the otherness of God to come and enter into an intimacy with you that will not drown you out, but will actually just touch you and evaporate. As your sins have done that to you. And here is a strange last twist in the imagination, right? The Midrashic Hasidic imagination on what it is to be an Avraham who's addressed Lech Lecha. Go to yourself. Who are you? You are someone whose sins have led him to God. Like the dew that touched, acted as some kind of a hint, some kind of a provocation. And in your case, because you are who you are, because you have something inside you that reacts like a chemical experiment, a chemistry experiment, you reacted to those sins by understanding that that's not Chaim. And it's through those sins that you, in other words, it's through the combination of opposites that you came to God. We call that a Baal Tshuva. But what is Tshuva? The idea of Tshuva is Tshuva me'ahava. Tshuva out of love turns even deliberate sins into something that one can do dream work on. One can use one's imagination around it, and one can understand where in the depths where it's leading me. I know I know that what I did at the time, but I know what I can make of that. Something I can make of that without, right? Forgetting here, it doesn't mean totally forgetting, it means transforming. Transforming, and then the inner world and the outer world, the sun and the inside of the fruit, move, right? They move in collaboration, they move together. That God comes and he doesn't pierce, he doesn't penetrate, he doesn't implant himself. Instead, he comes and says, you are doing it to yourself. Remember the sins and the fact that the sins have led you to me. So there's a sense of readiness, of passivity and activity in Abraham, that he is in a way waiting for the Lech Lecha call through all his previous experience. And at the same time, there is something in him that's actively waiting. Nothing else will fill him up. And that's the sense then of the delicacy of spiritual experience, that somewhere it doesn't come as a kind of implosion, otherness that blows one apart. Right? We'll come to Har Sinai and we'll see how that idea develops. But instead, it respects the intimacy of one's being and the depths of one's knowledge, one's inner knowledge of oneself. And God comes to Abraham in that mode, and God is then in Abraham in the most rarefied and, what can I say, spiritualized form. Spiritualized meaning that it enters into the combination of the person who is Abraham and who is the first progenitor. He's the first person to bring out things for himself in his seed, the life of the seed. I'm going to leave it there. I hope we got somewhere, although not to a final form. I can stay for a few minutes if that works for you, Yardena. Yardena, if you have.
Yeah, no problem.
Pardon?
No problem.
Yes. I was very moved by you saying that both God and Abraham regretted their quote projects or what they had done. I'm feel weird using that pronoun, but okay. Pronouns are confusing lately anyway. So I feel like I could include myself. I'm old enough now, so I look back on my life and I say, oh, I regret. Did you ever resolve about God regretting in your talk? Because I got lost there and I didn't know if you ever got back to that.
No, I think that's how we leave it. In other words, the regretting is something that has its results, has its consequences. But at the same time, a situation of regret or of not knowing what to do about a failed project can have a kind of intimation for the future in it, a sense that something will yet come of this, right? It looks, the large mass of things, the material, I can't use it anymore, but perhaps we'll still find a way of using it. And that's, in fact, that's what the Mahal story shows. Later we read that he goes through another change after the flood. So that's not by way of resolving. That's by evoking somehow the dynamism of who the Creator is in these sources, in these midrashic sources, which reflects human experience.
Well, you talk about artists, and of course I relate to that, so it's very touching to hear that.
Yes, I think we're all artists. I don't think that's stretching things too much.
Thank you.
Avivah?
Yes.
Hi. Ruthie Shane from Baltimore.
Yes, hello.
Yes. So I am so moved and so excited by the midrashic taking Avraham and turning him into the bride. It just brings something ideas so much closer to the surface that Avraham lives with and through Sarah. The two of them are, yes, they're a pair, but there's something about them being one. and they kind of, talk through each other. And I think it will come out better or more to the surface, perhaps in the scene with the three visitors who come, and God speaks to Abraham. Sarah laughed, but you laughed. No, she didn't laugh. She did laugh. It's as if Abraham is Sarah, and her laughter is really his laughter, and he's denying his own laughter, but pushing it off to Sarah. But somehow the two of them they're like one. They flow back and forth between each other. And you brought it out here where her barrenness is his barrenness. I just love that. Thank you so much.
Yes, I like that. The sense of Abraham as being plastic somehow. You know what I mean? He's material to work with. He's not a finished piece of it. So he can be a female as well. He can be Sarah as well. And of course, this is going to have very interesting and difficult repercussions when it comes to the Akedah, when he deliberately excludes Sarah from the Akedah. But that's next week. Anyone else?
I have a question. This is Keaton.
Yes, hello, Keaton.
Good to see you. As we are in this realm together of dreams and hints and perfumes and fog, maybe I wonder about the work of speech, and if there's another way of being with it together that might not involve speech that actually connects us more to it, because it feels like speech is both connecting it and occluding it at the same time.
What? When you say connecting, what's the object?
That we're speaking of this realm, this experience, this way of being, but even our words are pushing it away.
Well, that's the resistance. I think that's exactly working with clay is working with resistance. It's not having it all your own way. You've got a partner. So the words also are tzimtzum. The words are limits, and they are in some way impervious. They've got a block-like quality to them. You write down a word, another word, another word. You like everything that's not perfume. And yet, words can have a perfume effect. Right? In spite of itself and because of itself, because of the limitations. That's the idea of the opposites. And there's a sexual undertone in that as well. The opposites that find a way of creating something else.
Avivah, this is Penny. I'm very struck by the whole bringing together of Aliyah and this sense of Lech Lecha that many of us have experienced in various ways, and the young bride and not knowing what the journey is about. It's so apt.
Yes.
And that you don't know I don't know, it speaks to me very deeply. You don't know what your journey is about. And it may indeed not be what it seemed before you came.
So there is a kind of arbitrariness in a way about it, and yet one makes that choice or not, knowing that one hasn't got enough information, as Ramban says. It's not sufficiently explained, and we call that faith,
right?
But rather than use the word faith, which is I don't like to use the obvious word because it becomes a platitude. I would rather use the evocations and the dream language we've been using to give us a sense of an area that's not ruled by certainties.
Right. Thank you.
Are we done?
I have a thought. This is Ilana from, can you hear me, from Amherst, Mass?
Can I?
Yes. So I'm thinking about deeply thinking about God's despair and God's disillusionment, and thinking about too how these early chapters of Bereshit we're getting to know God, and that it just strikes me with the beauty of the images in these teachings that in a way what God is doing is a kind of lech lecha that mirrors Avram, that this kind of walking towards that is absence and presence that will be God's journey with us. And
it's very finely said. It's unique to the beginning of the Torah. After that, his feelings won't occupy such a central position. They would be more interested in the human experience. But at the beginning, it's strangely central. And it's almost as if what you have is what you have much later in the times of the Hasidim, of Hasidic writers. You have this notion of compassion for God. You know, the great tzaddikim spoke full of compassion for the God who must be suffering so much at the world, what's happening in the world, and a real feeling, which I know from the inside to some extent, of wanting to comfort God. You know, in some way, it's not a formal idea. There is a deep connection, a deep human connection with that idea. Yeah.
Can I add that that idea of walking, the God walking, it starts in the Gan when he's hitalech bagan. All he wants is he wants man to be with him. And then throughout the beginning, the earlier stories of Bereshit, it's man is described as like Noah is a hitalech, and for Avram too, all this idea of hitalech, to like get back to the Gan in some way, that the relationship there.
Maybe, yeah.
Right.
It's also very reflexive. It's that walking with oneself, and what is that walking with oneself? The self is not cut in stone. Okay, I think we'll stop there. And thank you very much for your faces and for your words and for your presence.
Thank you. Thank you so much.